It's wonderful to be here with all of you. They made me sound much busier than I actually am. Abigail, you're the busy one here. And before we dive in, I wanted to acknowledge that you've been using your position of privilege and enormous talent to condemn the inequities of the American businesses and how unfair tax codes are, things that you wouldn't ordinarily expect from a documentary filmmaker. But your name, as I like to say, is a snitch. You know, you represent in people's minds family and happy times and great memories and enduring characters that have delighted us across generations, which I think makes you actually the perfect person to address these issues of power. And we're going to talk all about that. And you have a huge body of work that if this was a film festival, we could spend hours on. But I want to focus on the documentary right now. Tell us a little bit about What About the American Dream? What motivated you to speak out about Disney, and particularly the condition of workers at the parks?
Well, thank you for that, Ellen, and thank you all for being here. So, how do I start? The park, as we call it in the family, is Disneyland in Anaheim. The Disney World Park didn't exist till 1971. I grew up at Disneyland, the park. And my grandfather used to take us there. Grandfather was Roy O. Disney, Walt's brother, and he co-founded the company with Walt. And he would often go down there and take us with him. We were sort of like his test audience. And what I remember are some of the nicest memories I have from growing up. I have memories of the way we would come in the side where the employees were taking a lunch break, and he would get out of the car and he'd be mobbed by people who were so happy to see him. He would never let anybody call him Mr. Disney. He hated that. Everybody called him Roy. And he asked about their families. He asked about their kids. Everybody knew it was so warm and so genuine. And I remember whenever we would walk through the entrance into the park, he would always sort of scan and see if he could find a piece of garbage or something on the ground that he could pick up and throw away. And when I asked him why he did that, he said, "Because, Abby, no one's too good to pick up a piece of garbage, and I want everyone to know that." So that was my grandfather, the COO, and then ultimately CEO of the company. That is how he understood his job. He was no better than anyone else. He didn't exist on top of a hierarchy, and he saw his job as creating livelihoods for people so that they could afford to raise their kids, send them to college, retire in comfort, get health care. So flash forward 50 plus years, and I get a Facebook message from two of the workers at the park who say, "We have been fighting and fighting and fighting with our union to try and get higher wages and better conditions at Disneyland." My first reaction was a little bit like, yeah, I'm sure you're exaggerating or whatever. And so I was a little ashamed of myself. And then I thought, okay, so just go here, go listen. That's the first rule of power. It does make you sick in the head if you don't listen. So I flew out to Anaheim. I live in New York City now. And I sat with a group of about 25 people. And what they told me, if my hair could catch fire, it would have caught fire, because I was so angry because I couldn't get out of my head what my grandfather taught me, which was, these people work so hard. You respect them. You never backtalk them. You never. And these people were being treated like interchangeable cogs in a machine. And it was so clear that they were seen as expendable, replaceable, and endlessly the same. So that was when I started to get involved in trying to figure out how you change this. And it struck me like Disney is such an important company. It's a leader in multiple industries, not just entertainment, but in hotels and hospitality and restaurants, and people follow what Disney does. And if they were to decide to do this differently, how many other companies might follow? So I wrote a long letter to the CEO, and ultimately, the response I got was very unsatisfactory, and so I ended up making a film about it. in the hopes that I could not just call Disney on the carpet for what it was doing, because it was unacceptable to pay your CEO $65 million in the same year that your employers are trying to decide whether they should buy insulin or food. That is not, there's no planet. I wanted to call them out specifically, but I also wanted to make sure everybody understood we're at a place we've been brought to by people who decided we should be in a place of pure Friedman-like capitalism. This isn't the only form of capitalism we have to practice. We've been brought here historically by people on purpose, and it can be changed. And all it involves is imagination and courage.
If you haven't seen the film, I cannot recommend it highly enough. Your hair will, in fact, catch on fire. But here you are 2 generations away from your grandfather's American dream, which has a nostalgic value of being actually true for him and lots of people, but not everyone. And now 2 generations later, you're out here on these streets calling for a truly progressive tax code, higher marginal tax rates on extremely high incomes, a wealth tax. You're reminding us that your grandfather paid a 90% marginal tax and still got very, very rich. What has it been like for you to become an advocate in this way? What has the backlash been?
Well, I'm a little radioactive in some spaces. I'm not always
You're welcome here. You're right at home here.
But you'd be amazed at how many people who've inherited money who agree with me. Because if you have a brain in your head and any kind of sense of perspective, then you've just been offered, the most ridiculous and unearned advantage that anyone can be offered. And when you go out into the world and you see the way it's arranged for everyone else, it just does not feel right to simply lean back and accept it. And so I started my tax advocacy around the inheritance tax because there was a real movement during the Bush administration to just eliminate it. Just eliminate the inheritance tax. And that it's so fundamentally un-American in terms of the way I understood how my grandfather came into the world, what he did as a person to build his wealth. He had plenty of wealth to accommodate 3 generations after himself, but he still helped build those roads and helped build the infrastructure of this company by paying a large marginal tax rate.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think everybody here agrees. If you, and yet you've poked the Disney bear.
Yes.
That's a big deal.
It's not a mouse, it's a bear.
That's a big deal. And not just because it's your name and your family legacy and your own history. You're challenging, and it happens in a very interesting way in the film. You're calling up Bob Iger, who's got a lot of things on his plate at the moment, and you're asking him to make some fundamental changes, which includes making sure that the people who create the experiences that delight us are paid a living wage. The stories that you've amassed are just horrific, but also taking a broader stand in the world, which sometimes he actually does.
Yes, he actually does, and I'm really proud of him in terms of how he's been in Florida around the Disney DeSantis thing. I'm really proud of him. I mean, he's not a bad guy. Kind of the point is he's nice, and nice isn't enough. The case I made to him originally when I first wrote him was, we all know you're getting ready to retire. We all know you've made lots of money. And you will be remembered by every business professional in this country as one of the best CEOs to ever have operated in this space. So congratulations. Do you want a legacy? If that legacy of business success is good enough for you, that's fine. But I don't suspect that is really that satisfactory to you, because what you have a chance to do here is to radically alter the way Disney functions, because this isn't just a question of raising the minimum wage. This is about management looking upon the people who work in those hourly jobs as their equals, and therefore valuing their needs and their dignity the same as you would value the needs and the dignity of your own children and yourself. And that's what's missing. The folks in management are, they call it the C-suite because it's so far away from everything. They have their own lunchroom, they have their own parking lot, they have their own elevator near their own bathroom. And they have constructed lives where they don't intersect. And so they're not invested in the human beings that work for them. And I said, Bob, like, imagine if you stepped into this space as a visionary and leader and you made a brave choice. And what if they fire you? So what? You're a multi-million, you're richer than I am. and like, so what? They fire you. You would have made this gesture and think of the people who would follow you.
Did that work? Did that argument work?
No. Weirdly, there was still more money to be made. And I think that this is a problem that's woven into the job of the CEO in a really unfortunate way.
Yeah.
Because you get a lot of power, you're praised a lot, you ultimately are surrounded by people who have a lot to gain by praising you and nothing to gain by telling you the truth.
Right.
And eventually it creates a kind of sickness.
Yeah, yeah. You should read her assessment of a Succession finale. But I want to talk about that sickness in a framework of power. A CEO is less and also more powerful than people think. There's a lot of other people behind the scenes whose names we may or may not know. What have you learned about talking to people in power? Because the truth of your thesis is that we need powerful people to care about people who publicly who are not as powerful as they are.
Yes.
And it takes a certain amount of financial sacrifice, but it takes a psychological and emotional one too.
It does, and I'm trying to be an example of a person. I mean, like I did some stuff around the Trump tax cuts, and it kind of went viral. And I found the next week a Snopes.com article. And if you don't know Snopes, it's like kind of a fact-checking site. And apparently somebody thought it was crazy enough that I had opposed tax cuts.
Okay.
That Snopes needed to write an article saying, yes, in fact, she did. Think of what that says about where we are as a culture, that it's so unbelievable to imagine that I would step out and advocate for something that I had everything to lose by getting, by succeeding at advocating for. It's not crazy to say, I want to use my power to expand my advantages and make sure that people have some of what I have, to make things more fair. And I want to be that example, first of all, so I want to put my money where my mouth is. And then, I try to, when I talk to very powerful people, is recognize the niceness. It's there. It's not nothing that they're nice, most of them. Some of them are really not. But within the context of that niceness, try a little bit to push. I got to admit, I'm a bit of a pushy bitch. And so I have burned some bridges, and there are some billionaires I'm not welcome back at their table. But
same girl.
Yeah. Sometimes I think you go ahead and say the gutsy thing in that room because you never know what later on he's going to be thinking about that.
That's it.
So make your mark.
That's it.
Say your thing. If it's your only shot, say it.
Plant the seeds.
Yeah.
No, that's really good. That's really important. So we have a lot of powerful and influential people here from a variety of sectors and coming at this from a variety of viewpoints. If you were going to create a wish list for us to go into the world to think more seriously about where we can start addressing some of this inequity, particularly at the frontline level, at the earlier, more vulnerable level, what would it be? I'm going to imagine that tuition reimbursement, for example, just isn't going to cut it.
No. We've created this series of imaginary things in our heads about how the economy works.
That's it.
Yeah. So the economy is like the weather. It just kind of happens. And it's like then if it's bad, you hide inside, and when it's good, you go outside, and everything is fine. It's not the weather. People make it happen. People make decisions all the time that shape the economy we live in. And it can be changed. We have it in our heads that it cannot be changed. Of course it can be changed. It got changed. That's why we're where we are. It got changed from an economy where there were three legs of the stool. It was labor, it was workers, and it was government. Business leaders, labor, and government. And they had a balanced relationship, which was thrown out of whack by advocates and people who spent a lot of money on that happening. So education doesn't answer the question of, if you see the workplace as like this ever-flowing escalator, and you get some education that takes you a little higher on the escalator, and then you go a little further and you go a little further. That's how we imagine it works in business. But unfortunately, what that escalator forgets or helps you forget to see is that at the bottom of the escalator, someone's always filling in that spot. Someone's always coming in at 11:25. That the 11:25 that you had to work your backbone off to get out of. So it's a way of tacitly acknowledging that we accept, and in fact, can't live without a class of people who live at the bottom all the time.
Right.
And that's the part we need to pay attention to. You know, it's not for nothing that our economy grew up and the British economy grew up around the same time, around the rise of industrial manufacturing and chattel slavery. And I'm sorry, I know that feels like maybe one thing has nothing to do with each other. But there was a lot of communication between those industrial leaders and the chattel slave owners who applied a lot of what they were learning about efficiency to the people who worked for them. I think we grew an economy around the concept that a certain amount of suffering was necessary on some people's part for us to have a healthy economy, and that is simply not true. And if we can just discipline ourselves to find the suffering unacceptable and behave as though it's unacceptable, we will have a different economy.
So I want to wrap up on a philosopher queen moment.
Okay.
Sorry, I had trouble with that. Because what I'm hearing you're saying is that the capitalist impulse to have proximity to power needs to be flipped, and powerful people need to have proximity to the actual human beings who make the engine run.
Yes.
I want to acknowledge you do an unusually good job at this. I've watched your work for a long time, but particularly in this documentary, you are in the story, but you don't make it about you, and you do a remarkably good job centering the voices of people who are more vulnerable in a way that maintains their dignity but gets their point across. A lot of powerful people don't do that well. We only have a couple of minutes left for this little mini master class. How can we all get better at really understanding the people we're trying to serve?
Right. The more power you have, there's a re-feralization process, I call it. We're all born feral animals. We're wild animals. And then, mom comes in and says, share your toys and be nice and don't bite and all that stuff, right? And that's how we turn out to be grown-ups. What I've noticed about very powerful people is they start forgetting those things, and like they go around really poorly dressed, they don't comb their hair. They forget all this basic stuff. And they lose some abilities, and nobody forces them to sit down and listen. So much philanthropy is characterized by people who have not learned how to listen to people who do not have power. There is a tacit agreement that those people without power don't have power because they've done something wrong or failed to do something, or they've earned their way to the bottom. So what needs to happen is that we need to watch that in ourselves. I mean, that's my existential state, is I'm always watching myself and getting corrected because I'm wrong all the freaking time. We have to accept that we're wrong sometimes, graciously accept the criticism, graciously be grateful for people who criticize us, and then listen. Just shut up for a second and hear people. And you would be amazed at what you could learn from people maybe you didn't think mattered. And that's what we need in ourselves, and that's what we need to bring into boardrooms. That's why I think there should be workers on every corporate board of directors in America. I don't understand why we don't have that. And that's why diversity is a strength, right? Because if you're in a diverse room and you're listening, there's no end to what you learn.